to me, it's really sort of the local queens who have made the stud what it is and made it home, like people like Hekalina and Pippi Lovestocking and Peaches Christ and Cookie Dough and Suppository Spelling and so many more. There's a lot more names that I'm leaving out. But these are the people who really breathed life into this venue and created a scene that kind of became the envy of, the envy the world over, in its diversity and in its free-spiritedness and its persistence.
Hello, my name is Kay Anderson, and you are listening to Lost Spaces, the podcast that mourns the death of queer nightlife. Every episode, I talk to a different person about a venue from their past, the memories they created there, and the people that they used to know. Today's guest has a pretty damn impressive CV. She is the recently elected chair of the San Francisco Democratic Party, as well as the co-founder of San Francisco's Transgender District, which happens to be the first transgender district in the world, so no small feat there. Oh, yeah, and you might know her as a contestant on Season 5 of RuPaul's Drag Race, where she showed off, amongst other things, her love of a good kaftan. If you haven't guessed already, my guest today is drag royalty Honey Mahogany. In 2016, Honey became a co-owner of The Stud after it became the very first cooperatively owned nightclub in the United States. The bar, which was San Francisco's oldest queer bar, having first opened in 1966, was unfortunately another victim of COVID-19, and the collective chose to close in 2020. We caught up to discuss Honey's early days in drag, what makes San Francisco drag so unique, and why the bar will always have a special place in Honey's heart. So, you are a born and raised San Franciscan. San Franciscan. Yes. That's right.
That's right.
And it's not something like San Francisco.
San Francisco? No, San Franciscan.
Oh, I like San Francisco. Let's make that a thing. So you must have seen a huge amount of change in the queer scene over the last decade.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if I had to pick one thing that's changed a lot, I would say that it's probably drag. And maybe that's a good measure of how the scene has changed. But really, it's many different things.
Are we about to start slagging off a certain TV show?
I guess we could. For me, I think because I was very much a part of the drag scene for decades, and that was much of my sort of queer experience of San Francisco, I do remember a time when drag was not popular and people were made, sort of ostracized or, looked down upon for doing drag, and also where drag was quite regional. And even within San Francisco, we had such a diversity of drag scenes, and we still do to some extent today, but it has sort of homogenized a bit due to its popularity and also, being sort of not just a national, but a worldwide phenomenon where we have now sort of come up with a definition of what drag is and what drag looks like and what one should aspire to. But even just, 10 years ago, when Drag Race was just sort of picking up, drag to me was very regional, and you could get all sorts of different drag. I mean, the drag in San Francisco looked very different from the drag in New York, which looked very different from the drag in the South or Chicago. And then again, even within San Francisco, it was like the drag in the South of Market area, which was much more of a leather sort of focused scene was very different from what was happening in the Castro or what was happening in North Beach or other parts of town.
So then let's talk about that. What made San Francisco drag unique? I mean, first of all, I'm kind of struggling to get my head around drag in a leather setting.
Well, I mean, so it does exist, or especially now.
It sounds very, very niche.
Yeah. I think that the leather scene is interesting. I mean, if you really look back at the history of it, it's got like, its focus. Sorry, let me back up a little bit. The leather scene really started as a sort of a meshing of like the Hells Angels and the gay scene back in the 50s, maybe even earlier than that. The Hells Angels were this sort of alternative group that rode around on motorcycles, and they were also pretty principled, and they were in an area of town that was very industrial. It wasn't like a very glamorous place. And that was also the area where we had like bathhouses and like, gay bars. And, as the 60s came around and, gay people really started to come to San Francisco as a place that was sort of a haven, the Hells Angels sort of began to sort of build a relationship and look out for some of the queers and, protected them to a certain extent. And so I think there was this sort of mutual admiration that kind of grew out of that. And, the gay men of those scenes, of those neighborhoods started to appropriate some of those, qualities, and take on some of that like masculine, like protective, facade, and put on the leather chaps, even though they maybe didn't ride motorcycles, and the leather caps. And then, of course, it became fetishized by Tom of Finland. And, a whole scene kind of really grew out of the San Francisco sort of Soma queer culture, and became the gay leather scene. Anyway, that is a complete tangent from what we were talking about, but I find that stuff fascinating.
Yeah, really fascinating. But like, so then where does the drag element come in? Especially because it's like this hyper masculine and almost a rejection of what is considered stereotypically gay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is hypermasculinity within the leather scene, and there are some pretty leather scenes have pageants and things, and even though that's not necessarily hypermasculine, it is in a way. But something that I think is important to note is that there have always been, like, even within those hypermasculine spaces, like flamboyant men who broke the mold, and that has been happening since I think the very beginning of leather. And I think leather had space for those types of things, even if there were certain people who, according to Ray Spannon, who is, a prominent leader within the leather scene here in San Francisco, most people who are really hardline Leathermen mask only, they are in the far minority, and leather people tend to be much more open-minded. And, there are queens that have towed the line, right? Bearded queens like Grace Towers, who's always considered herself a Soma queen and showed up in leather halters and heels. And, we have a rich history of that here in San Francisco. But when I really think about Soma drag, and how it overlaps with the leather community, a lot of it is really focused on the stud, which is, until recently was San Francisco's oldest continuously operating LGBT nightlife venue. So it opened in 1966 in Soma, and it actually had the intention of being another leather bar. At the time, there were, over time, there had been something like 60 different leather businesses gay leather businesses in the South of Market area.
Wow.
And at the heyday, there were probably 30 things open at the time. And so the stud was one of those things. And it quickly, I think, found a niche as not being a leather bar, but really a place where hair fairies and, hippies and Leathermen and Castro clones could all sort of come and dance, and was really focused on the music that it created.
Okay. So before we go any further, I just want to ask some questions about the terms that you've used here. Hair fairy. Mm-hmm. What is that?
So back in the 60s, someone who grew out their hair really long and, was a hippie basically.
Ah, okay, cool, cool. I think I'm with you. And then Castro clones, is that like a disco thing?
Sort of, tight white t-shirts, muscly, lean, tight jeans, the sort of like Tom of Finland without the leather kind of look with the bowl cuts and
Ah, okay. So like very clean and tidy
clean and
and
tidy,
tight
kind of, all look the same, at the time, all white.
and bathed in some horrible cologne.
Right. Well, yeah,
Okay. I think I get what you're saying. And so like we're here to discuss the stud today, right?
Yeah. So this is a good transition, actually.
Yeah, and I mean you're doing my job for me, so that's amazing. So then, would you consider yourself to be a leather queen?
No, I mean, I think not because I wouldn't want to associate myself with that. I definitely consider myself a soma queen, but I definitely also have like a deep respect for, the work that goes into leather culture. And, I don't regularly polish my leather goods. They get a little worn out. And I don't, doll myself up in leather frequently. Although I have had a signature leather jacket for decades that I would wear all the time. Although more recently I stopped doing that. But yeah,
Perfect
no, I
for
don't.
San Francisco weather.
Right.
And okay. So you're probably not going to be able to answer this question for me, and I am just asking you to speak on behalf of the entire leather community. So apologies in advance. But so I've been vegan for like 15 years, and that's what's always prevented me from like looking into that scene at all. But I wondered whether or not there was like a pleather queen subset.
I think that they exist within the scene. I mean, I guess that.
You're like, shut up, let's move on, don't ask me this.
I mean, I don't know. I don't know all of the intricacies of those conversations, but, I'm sure there are some snooty leather people that would be like, that's not real leather. And then there are others that are, trying to be environmentally conscious. And so.
Yeah,
I
I
don't
mean,
know.
we wouldn't be the queer scene if there wasn't some kind of infighting.
Exactly.
Right, okay. So then in terms of the stud, why did you want to talk about that venue in particular?
Well, I mean, I am one of the co-owners, so, it's very near and dear to my heart. But beyond that, I think the story of the stud is a very San Francisco story. I think it has a lot of rich history. Like I said, it's one of the, oldest continuously operating LGBT nightlife venues in San Francisco. And it really, I think, helped shape what San Francisco drag is. And also in a lot of ways, I think has shaped, queer culture in San Francisco. We have had a lot of movements sort of start here in the city. And, I know a lot of people point to Stonewall as, sort of the fomenting of the gay liberation movement. And I think that's true. But there were many other uprisings that sort of like led to that, including one that happened 3 years prior in San Francisco in 1966, the Compton's cafeteria riots, which is the first documented collective uprising of LGBT people in the US. And at that same time, that was also the year that the stud opened. And the stud also has, a lot of other cool things that have happened there. Like in the 60s, there was obviously the gay liberation movement, but there was also the civil rights movement fighting for, racial equality here in the US. And around that time, it was a very similar time to what was happening now, or what is happening now, in that there was a lot of conversations around racial justice and coalition building and protesting. And there was a leader within the Black Panther Party and the Black Civil Rights Movement named Huey Newton, who's based in Oakland. And he made a call to, to folks to build alliances between the civil rights movement and the women's movement and the gay liberation movement as well. And one of the first places that the Gay Liberation Front and the Black Panthers first met was actually at the Stud,
Ah.
because it was, yeah, so it was seen as a sort of a place where everyone was welcome, and that is something that actually hung on a sign at the Stud for decades.
Ah. Oh wow. Okay. So I'm like getting a proper history lesson today. But before we get into any of that, I'd like to just find out a little bit more about you in relation to the Stud. Do you remember the first time that you went there?
Um, I think that the first time that I went there was actually I was working at an organization called Larkin Street Youth Services, which is it serves homeless and at-risk youth, and it also does some. They have several properties where they also house youth, including youth in the foster system. And I was working in one of those places as a sort of a counselor. And I remember leaving work and, just being like, oh, it would be nice to grab a drink or a beer or something. And the Stud was just a few blocks away. And so I went over to the Stud and sat down at the bar and had a drink with the bartender, whose name was George, who was super friendly. And it was a pretty chill evening, and, ran into a couple folks there and just sort of started to build community. And that was really, I think, the first time that I had been to a queer bar outside of the Castro, because I think when you're first, coming out in the LGBT scene, everybody knows about the Castro. It's like, oh, the Castro is like the center of the gay universe, and that's where things happen, and that's where you're supposed to go. But really, there was so much more outside of the Castro that, to me, was more interesting because it was maybe just not as broadly covered or known about. So just, felt a little more secretive and like there was more there.
Ah, okay. So then you might have to just educate me a little on what the different scenes are like in San Francisco. Does the Castro fall into that kind of hen party, touristy, very commercial type scene?
Yes, and I think it also has been able to preserve a lot of its uniqueness. I mean, the city of San Francisco, I think, in general, is pretty good about preserving some of the more unique characteristics of our neighborhoods. There are a lot of neighborhoods that won't allow like formula retail, for example, to open up. Um, the Castro does have some formula retail, but it has a lot of sort of community-based old businesses and institutions that have been open for a really long time. So in that sense, I do think it has maintained a lot of its character. At the same time, it is very much sort of the mainstream queer neighborhood with a lot of rainbow flags and like a lot of like niche sort of stores that are very, very much cater to the people who come to, who want to come to a gay neighborhood, like, the penis cookies at Hot Cookie and.
That's for every neighborhood.
Is it?
I think so, like especially when they're decorated with white icing.
Yes. Well, in San Francisco, I've only ever seen them in the Castro, but I assume that they could be other places as well. So in a sense, it does, I think cater to tourists and people who come to visit, Harvey Milk's camera store and Harvey Milk Plaza and the Castro Theater and all of those things. But I don't know. I don't want to bash the Castro because I think that there's a lot of really wonderful things about it, and it's really kind of a joy and kind of refreshing sometimes for me to go there because it is so different from all the other neighborhoods in San Francisco.
But it can, like, sorry to put words in your mouth, but are you saying that like it can feel as though that's like the first step on a queer journey for lots of people?
It does, in that sense, it feels a little bit, oh God, I don't want to say it, but like it does feel a little bit basic in a sense because it feels
Just
very
say
like,
it. Just say
I did, I just did, I just did.
it.
I mean, it feels, it does feel a little basic in that it's like sort of, again, the first step or like everyone knows about the Castro. So it's easy. It's like, oh, it's gay. It's very loud about being gay. Everything's covered in rainbows. In that sense, it's just very obvious. And there is a
And
lot of
sometimes that is amazing. Sometimes that's just what you need.
oh, absolutely. I mean, it's gay pride 365. And that is, like I said, refreshing for me to go there sometimes and just experience that and like drink that in. And, and that is just the top layer of the cake because, obviously there is a lot of layers of history there of, how the Castro came to be and, different things that happened there and discrimination and, again, like race relations within the Castro and how women have been treated historically in the Castro and how that's evolved over time. Like those are all really important conversations that I think continue to happen and continue to move forward. And I think there's been a lot of progress made over the years. But, for me, like I find, again, like places like the Tenderloin and the South of Market, which have histories that are just as rich in terms of their queer culture and specifically queer histories, but also in places like the Tenderloin that were gay neighborhoods far before the Castro was a gay neighborhood. I just find that stuff fascinating and more appealing. I think personally find the neighborhoods that like the Tenderloin and Soma just to be more interesting because they do have, actually the Tenderloin specifically has, and the Lower Polk, which is another historically queer neighborhood, actually has a longer history as a gay neighborhood than the Castro does. And so I just find that stuff fascinating and, these neighborhoods also tend to be much more diverse, much more people of color there and who live there in the neighborhood. And so I just find the intersectionality of all of that fascinating and more
then, so
interesting.
how did the Castro become like the center of queer life in San Francisco if it wasn't the oldest?
Well, I think Harvey Milk had a lot to do with that. No, I think the Castro was already becoming sort of a queer place before Harvey Milk. The Castro actually historically before it was a gay neighborhood was sort of a Scandinavian neighborhood. There, we still have the Swedish American music hall there, and there were many other sort of Scandinavian markets in the neighborhood that sort of have existed for generations. But and then after those folks sort of dispersed and sort of got absorbed into the broader sort of white culture, there was it became sort of a working class Irish neighborhood. And then I think in the late 50s, early 60s, when desegregation was happening in the schools, there was across the United States a white flight of white people fleeing the cities and going to the suburbs because they didn't want to integrate and they didn't want their children to have to integrate. So they went to school districts and places where people of color did not exist or live, which opened up all of these homes and the costs of rents and the costs of houses just plummeted in the city, and that allowed a lot of the people who were queer, who San Francisco was a naval base, right? A huge naval base, and so you had a lot of people who had joined the military because maybe they were kicked out of their families, or maybe they knew that they weren't going to get married and have kids, and so they went and joined the military to make something of themselves, and got kicked out because they were queer or whatever, and then just got discharged in San Francisco and, found each other and created a scene here. And then, all of a sudden there are all these empty houses in the Castro, these beautiful Victorians, and they all, were able to live there for a couple, $100 a month. And they did. And it created this kind of magical scene where people didn't have to work very much. You know, I hear stories of people saying that they worked maybe 1 or 2 days a week at a cafe and they spent the rest of their, weeks partying and creating art.
Oh
And that was really
man.
special. Yeah, I know.
I mean,
Isn't that amazing?
I know their circumstances to get there weren't like, good circumstances, but like, yeah, my main
Yeah,
takeaway is like, damn it, they got cheap rent.
I
Ah,
know.
jeez.
When is that going to happen again?
Okay, well, let's just not ponder on that because I think that's a bit of a road to ruin. So really interesting
Yeah.
though that there are all of these neighborhoods with their own distinct kind of queer identity, and the center of Soma, which is south of Market, right? Yeah. Okay. Cool. I'm learning new things today. I picked up. Oh, yeah. And the other kind of random offshoot question that I have, which is like, why is it called the Tenderloin? Is it because it's a meatpacking district?
No. The Tenderloin, that has a very deep history as well. Essentially, like a lot of neighborhoods are called the Tenderloin, and this goes back to really, I think, police corruption,
Oh, yay!
but
Police
also sort of
corruption.
like governmental corruption, because the Tenderloin was created as a vice district, and it was a place where gambling happened during Prohibition, where there were speakeasies. So a lot of money could be made if you were a nefarious individual. And then also it was the neighborhood where the police oftentimes made a lot of money because they would be paid off by a lot of these establishments. So it was sort of like the juiciest cut of the city because you could make so much money on the
Oh,
black market or
wow.
illegally there.
So,
Yeah.
it's so fascinating then that word got like officially adopted, like it kind of somehow legitimized the whole thing.
Yeah. It
Oh,
was
how
known as the
weird.
Tenderloin.
How weird. Okay. All right. So more San Francisco lessons for me.
Hmm.
And then let's talk about your drag and the influence that the stud had on it. Had you already been doing drag before you went to the stud?
Yes, although not consistently and not in a way that I think was very serious. Not that drag is ever very serious, but well, maybe nowadays. But I would do it occasionally and kind of play with it, and it was something that I had done in college, and I sort of put away for a while, and it was being at the stud that kind of like re-inspired me to do drag again because I
Well,
got to.
so sorry to interrupt. So just like, why did you feel like you wanted to put it away? Was it like, I finished college, I'm going to be an adult now and I'm going to grow up? Or like, were there other factors?
I think there were other factors. I don't know that I ever, again, at that time, like drag was not something that was seen as something you could do as a career. It was not something that if you were a drag queen, you didn't really get laid. And also, I think for me, there was also this other deeper layer in that, like, I was sort of outed to my family through drag. And so, like, someone, sort of circulated a picture of me in drag. And so that also had an element of it, I think, of like it being painful for me.
And then, so who was that person then? And like, why did they share the photo? And were they being malicious?
I think it was a cousin of mine, and I don't know that they were. I don't know if it was malicious or out of concern, but I mean, ultimately, it was a shitty thing to do.
Yeah, that's tough.
Yeah, I mean, it's fine. I mean, it was a long time ago, but it was definitely, I think, a part of why I kind of hung my drag up for a while.
Can we also talk then about getting laid in drag and the stigma that comes with being a queen and the way that people kind of view it negatively? And going back to the conversation that we had before about how much it's changed over the last decade, do you think that getting laid has changed?
I I think so. At least, I mean, I can't speak for the world, but I think in San Francisco, it definitely has changed. I think that there may still be some people that are just like very self-hating, that don't want to have sex with someone who does drag because they feel like it is too feminine and says something about that person's masculinity or ability to, I don't know, have sex. But it's such a weird thing. But I think overall it's become much more widely accepted, and there are definitely people who are like drag chasers, who want to have sex with drag queens, especially if they've been on TV.
Yeah. And like, that's the whole other side of it, isn't it? Like, there are some people who are going to just discount you out of the gate and not pay any attention to you. And then there are some people that are kind of like not really interested in you as a person, but interested in you as a thing.
Yes, absolutely.
And how do you like navigate that when like the only time you're meeting new people is when you're in a bar and in drag?
Well, I think one of the things you can do is have sex with people who are attracted to that. But,
and see what happens.
And see what happens. Yeah. I mean, and then I think depending on what kind of situation you find yourself in. I mean, I think that there are people who, there was definitely a period of time where I was more likely to probably hook up with men who would self-identify as straight than I was with other, queer people. But, thankfully, I think I'm no longer at that point in my life, and I'm partnered now, so I don't have to worry about it. But I do think that, again, it's just become much more, drag has just become accepted, and it's not something that folks are ashamed of anymore. And I think it's also allowed us to sort of really look at gender roles and, how we also express gender and what that means, and the fact that gender is a performance or can be a performance, and it's not necessarily always related to your identity, and how that can shift and change over time. And people also just feeling more comfortable with themselves, because I think that, a lot of the reason that people, despised drag is because it flew in the face of this binary sort of heteronormative system that people, saw as the ideal, even if they were queer. And, drag called that into question, and sort of was flung in the face of that, in a way that made them uncomfortable.
Yeah.
When they were trying to fight for things like gay marriage and pretend like they were, that queer people were trying to say, well, we're just like you guys. We just love somebody different, and
how boring.
When really I think queer people are different in that but different and also essential, right? Like we are an important part of society. We've always been here. We've always been a part of the world. And, our function and our roles have changed over time. But, we're just as important as queer people, and our sexuality is just as important as that of straight people.
Yeah. Like, we don't need to like assimilate to be valid.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, like, every time we start talking about the stud, I take us off in a different direction. So I apologize for that. So you were telling me that you were re-inspired.
I was re-inspired to do drag again when I was at the stud, because I specifically remember being at a show called Pink Slip. And it was a show that happened after... so I should back up and say that the stud is home to an iconic show, which has a name that it is now controversial, but was not controversial at the time. So disclaimer that we call it T-Shack now when we refer back to it, but its name was Tranny Shack. And it really came out of like the early 90s punk rock, and it sort of established punk rock drag as a real scene, kind of coming out of the era of the Cockettes in the 80s, and really sort of seizing on the inspiration from people like Bjork and David Bowie, and sort of gender, fuck, glam rock, that whole punk rock, that whole aesthetic rolled into a drag queen and put up on stage was Tranny Shack. And it really, I think, defined what the San Francisco drag scene became, at least on a when looked at on a national perspective or international perspective, and really kind of, I think, shaped the conversation of, what drag can do and can look like outside of pageantry and female illusionism. It was kind of fantastic. But so that show came to an end in the mid 2000s or late 2000s, I think. And that's when I started going to the Stud, and that is when this new show called Pink Slip came in, and the hostess, her name was Virginia Suicide, and she was a live singing rock and roll drag queen. And I remember, like, kind of gothic, like all in black, white makeup, piercing blue eyes, and singing, and like full-throated singing. And I remember being so inspired by her and just being like, oh my God, that is what I want to do. I want to go up there and, sing live and be a drag queen and have it be fierce. And yeah, so that's how I got inspired to start doing drag again.
Ah, okay. And so was that then where your first performance was, like at the Stud?
I can't remember exactly, to be honest, but I know that I was performing at the Stud at Pink Slip. Well, I do remember that I think my first time performing there was definitely at Pink Slip, and I remember I sang "Summertime," and I remember I was wearing a red American Apparel shirt dress with a belt around my waist and a shake and go wig and black tights, I think.
And like nothing paints a picture of the mid 2000s like American Apparel does.
I know. Or baby drag. Yeah. But it was also like, I think, and that's, how I sort of got introduced to a lot of people who are still in my life today. I think there were some people like, Mr. David Glamamore, who is an amazing performer and seamstress and couturier, and has was, I think, based in New York, but came to San Francisco in the late 90s, and really sort of established the House of Moore, and people like Juanita Moore, who is also like another local legendary queen, kind of adopted me into their family. So yeah, I mean, it was significant, and it was definitely a moment in time that sort of changed the direction of my life. And it was all at the Stud.
Aww. And so then, is this the right time to talk about what happened to the Stud?
Well, I think like many other businesses during lockdown, we were forced to close. But I will say that the Stud has been in sort of a precarious place for a while now. It had been it had been sort of carrying on for quite a while in this very laissez-faire way. I think, the owners of the building really loved the owners of the business and what the Stud was doing and what the Stud was about. And they had a very reasonable rent. And that reasonable rent allowed the Stud to sort of be experimental in its programming and sort of be very relaxed. And so, again, that spirit of anything goes and everyone was welcome was able to happen because people weren't worried about like, oh my gosh, we didn't get enough bodies in the door and we're not going to be able to make rent. No, I mean, they were paying just a few $1,000s a month. So they were able to do whatever they wanted. And then, the owner of the building passed away, and, their beneficiaries sold the building without anybody at the Stud knowing. And the new owners ended up, hiking the rent, basically tripling it. To the point where it was no longer sustainable for that owner. And he put the business up for sale in the hopes that the community would be able to buy the business and save the Stud. And so a group of us, about 18 folks, got together and we formed a collective because none of us had the resources to purchase it on our own. And we saved the Stud from closure. We're able to negotiate a new lease with the landlord, but it was at that much higher rental rate. And, over time, the rent actually went higher every year. And we knew that even though we kind of had put off the inevitable, that eventually we would have to move. So when COVID hit, we, again, like our lease at that point was renewed on a yearly basis. And so we were on a 1-year lease. And when COVID hit, we were 3 months into that 1-year lease. And we realized that if we were already looking for a new space, we knew that whatever space we went into would probably cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars in renovation, and moving fees, etc. And we felt like if we were to stay open or stay, keep having to pay rent and all of that for months without any known, end to the pandemic in sight, that we would quickly become so far in debt that we may not be able to save the stud in the long term. So we were able to get out of our lease early on during the pandemic by, I think, June. And therefore live to fight another day. And now we do a lot of digital programming. We have our studsf.com website where we sell our merchandise. We have our Twitch TV channel where we host different drag shows and DJ sets and events. And we also have our podcast that we do, Stud Stories, that really looks at the history of the stud and connects it with different people in throughout time. So, yeah.
And then, so what was that like in terms of coming to terms with having to make that decision?
I think for many of us, we felt a little bit like, oh, this feels like a failure, but I'm also a Capricorn and I'm very practical. And I knew that it was the best business decision we could make. And that making a good business decision in this case also came along with whether or not we would be able to be around in the long term. So I very quickly, practically was on board. But I also, have a lot of love for that location and actually currently live literally right across the street from it. So it's a sore reminder of the fact that we are no longer there. Although it is actually much more of a reminder of all the good times and good memories that I had there. So.
Yeah, and like the downside of living so close to a venue is that you've not really got an excuse when someone rings you at like 10 o'clock on a weeknight and says, "Oh, I'm here. Why don't you come in for a drink?"
Yeah, well, but I actually don't mind that. I don't.
Oh, really?
Well,
even if it was me.
Yeah, especially if it was you.
Oh, no, but yeah, like there are some nights when you're just like, I do not want to go out tonight. And then, yeah, if someone rings, it's just all that guilt. Anyway, that's a me thing. That sounds like it's a me thing, something I need to work through and not bring to this conversation. So you were pragmatic about things.
I was.
And like, how did everyone else react?
I think people were mostly pragmatic. I think people were all across the spectrum. We definitely all had tears at some point, but I think, the location also had a lot of challenges that were logistical and physical. It was old. The building was kind of falling apart. And, the landlords, weren't doing anything to upkeep it. And we had inherited it in its current state and didn't really have the money to do anything about it. So, I think a lot of folks were sort of ready, and again, we had been planning on moving since we took over the business. Like we had been perpetually looking for new locations because we knew that the current situation was not sustainable. So it wasn't completely out of the blue, but it was definitely, much more brusque and rushed, and we didn't have the time that we thought we would to say goodbye.
So in wrapping up the conversation, if we could just do some cheesy things, because that's kind of my brand. If you were to describe the stud in one word, what would it be?
Queer.
Oh, you did that. You did that far too quickly. Okay, well, how about we add 4 more? That was way too easy.
Oh, you need 4 more words. Queer. Let's see, other words.
Oh, now I've made it too hard.
Well, because queer is so perfect.
Okay. Well, let's just stick with one word, and that one word is queer. So then what did that venue teach you about yourself?
That I am, I think, brave enough to try things, that I'm open-minded, that I am somebody who, yeah, I mean, I think that I'm somebody, I think that's the main thing, is that I think the stud has shown me how open-minded I am, and that I am willing to sort of experience different things, and even things that make me uncomfortable, and that I also can have a broad definition of what community looks like.
Do you have any memories of the stud? Is there anything about today's episode that you would like to talk about? Maybe the stigma of being a drag queen and how that's changed over the years. Well, if you would, I would love to hear from you. Please get in touch and let's have a chat about the show and where we should go next on Lost Spaces. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter with the user handle Lost Spaces Pod. And whilst you're there, make sure you follow Honey on Instagram at Honey Mahogany. And if you'd like to know anything more about the stud, maybe buy a t-shirt or listen to their podcast, go to their website www.studsf.com, and that's SF for San Francisco. Genius, right? Lost Spaces is not only a podcast, but a concept record as well. I have been writing songs about queer venues and the people who used to live their lives there, and will be releasing songs over the coming year. You can hear the first single, Well Groomed Boys, which is also playing underneath my talking right now on all good streaming platforms. If you enjoyed today's episode, I would really appreciate if you subscribed, left a review on Apple Podcasts, or just told someone who you think might be interested in giving it a little listen too. I am Kay Anderson, and you have been listening to Lost Spaces.